This show is brought to you by Safety FM.
Hi listeners, this is Brent Sutton. Welcome to episode 23 of the Practice of Learning Teams. Today's podcast is the final in a series of 4 episodes, and we took the podcast on a virtual tour of Australia and looking at how the Australians are applying learning teams to improve organisational learning. On today's show, I'm joined by my fellow colleagues Glynis McCarthy and Brent Robinson. We will conduct a mini learning team on the key threads and themes that emerged during our virtual tour of Australia. In episode 20, we spoke with Deirdre Lewis and we explored about using learning teams for crisis events, the difference between sharing versus learning with learning teams, how to prepare leadership for learning teams and psychological safety, justifying the cost of a learning team, using learning teams for successful work, the importance of coaching and mentoring facilitators of learning teams, the value of soak time, and finally using learning teams outside of safety. In episodes 21 and 22, we spoke with Stephen Harvey and Tony McConachie, and we explored using learning teams versus ICAM and Taproot, the importance of having a strategy to embed learning teams, the power of storytelling, the role of health and safety reps in learning teams, using learning teams for critical risk analysis, dealing with larger groups in learning teams, the importance of the facilitator to reflect to improve performance, the importance of coaching and mentoring others, the importance of post-job review and feedback into the system for learning, removing self-imposed rules, using learning teams to remove non-value activities, using the power of conversations in pre-job and pre-start work, using learning teams to evaluate the effectiveness of change, using learning teams outside of safety management, and we also had the conversation about the safety 1 versus safety 2 debate, or should it just be about learning organisations? We wrapped up about the value of being a learning organisation, and then how to look for opportunities for improvement or opportunities for alignment. So, please join the 3 authors of the book The Practice of Learning Teams as we now conduct our mini learning team on those key threads and themes that emerge from these podcasts. Learning teams and psychological safety. About every second article I read these days has the word psychological safety appearing. But what does psychological safety mean in the context of a learning team? I think this is a really valuable conversation for us to have about when is psychological safety present, how was psychological safety created, and what's the effect on of a learning team if we actually don't have that psychological safety. So I'll start off by saying it's the leader who is really there to support the session of the learning team or to help create that framing for that safe environment for people to come along and participate. Any thoughts about the leadership side around creating psychological safety?
Yeah, I think it's really important that the leaders do create that framework that people can work within, but then leave it to the facilitator or whoever's running that learning team session to empower the people that are in that session to drive it forward. But it is super critical that they leave that feeling in that room or that space or wherever they're doing it, that they're there and they're safe, and whatever's mentioned is good, and it's all about the individuals in the organization moving forward. And I think that's so powerful if you get that right.
I agree with you, Brent. I think what the leaders do is they, in fact, give permission for the session to take place, and at what level will the session take place? Will it be just, surface level, or will people actually dive deeper and think more critically about the issue? And then I think it's the role of the facilitator, that the facilitator is the one that really sets the tone and keeps that tone and manages that tone throughout the session. And I think that the workers move in and out of feeling psychologically safe. For me, that psychological safety is about being able to express yourself. It is feeling courageous enough to put forward your opinion, even when your opinion isn't fully formed, but being able to kind of develop a thread of thought and allow other people to jump in and to validate or to question or to rephrase things. So that there really is kind of three stakeholders within that mix.
Yeah, I think that point about facilitation is really the key, because I think at the start of those sessions that people have to build that trust with the facilitator along that session, even though the leader has come in and to your point, give them permission. But I think that trust builds over a period of time if the facilitator is getting that job, done correctly. I don't know, it's not really correctly, but really helping each individual feel that they're part of the conversation and what they're saying is valued. And when you start those, sometimes you can feel people are sitting back, but as the conversation rolls on, if it's going well, then they start building in and filling in and building that narrative as we go along.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that Deirdre spoke about so clearly was that even when the facilitator is known to you, so even when the facilitator is, say, your colleague, maybe somebody on your team, your supervisor, a middle manager, actually when they come into that role in the learning team, they take on a different sort of guise. And so it is very much up to them to be able to set the tone so that people do have the opportunity to review critically the issues at hand.
So when I looked at this, I basically came out with 8 key factors in terms of that psychological safety. And the first one is that people need to be listened to. They need to feel that they're being listened to. They need to be able to give ideas. They need to be able to raise issues. They need to be able to be acknowledged. They need to feel that they can challenge. And they also need to be recognised as being competent. In other words, they need to be recognised as the expert of the view that they hold. And all this rolls back to the whole thing about feeling respected in that learning team's process as well.
Yeah.
And I think there's a difference between the handover from the leader who is trying to create the frame versus the facilitator who is then taking that group through the process. And just recently I was having this very interesting conversation conducting a learning team where there was some feedback that they felt that not everyone was contributing. And it really made me think hard, because the fact is not everyone has to contribute. I think there's a difference between people that are participating, being there, being present, people that are engaged, people that are contributing, and then you've got people that are challenging. And what I've seen is that the more that people participate in a learning team, the more up the path they tend to follow over time.
Yep.
So we can't expect people to come into a learning team on the very first time and all of them are into challenging mode. I just don't think that's realistic. Thoughts?
But I don't know if you want everybody in challenging mode either. I think, it is about building that narrative. And you, to your point, you want some people that are challenging, you want some people that are participating, and you want some people that are listening and might come into it much later on and say, well, I've heard this and this is one of the things I think. I think all those things are really, really powerful. And I totally agree with your point around some people might not participate at the same level, but that's really back to that facilitator's skill, isn't it? Of making sure that people are feeling like they're included, but they don't have to have the spotlight on them. You don't want to spotlight them and say, well, you haven't put in much.
Well, yes, you don't want the facilitator to point out and say, why aren't you contributing?
Yeah.
Why aren't you speaking?
I have seen that happen, though.
But just as we're saying that the facilitator needs some competencies, actually so do the people who are participating in the learning team. So to expect everybody to be competent in the first learning team experience, I just think we're asking too much of people. You know, there will be some people that will want to jump in boots and all, and there will be other people that will want to observe and see how the process unfolds. Again, it's about setting up those learning teams really well. It's making sure that it is explicit, the permission from the leaders about what are you trying to achieve here. It's about being very clear from the facilitator's point of view about leading and modeling good practice and following a kind of a process in terms of how do you get people to feel comfortable, how do you start to explore, how do you critically reflect, and then it's about people adopting that skill set.
I was really interested to hear Deirdre, Stephen and Tony talk about the need for coaching and mentoring of facilitators and learning teams. And it gave me some time to think about some of the stuff they were saying. And what we're seeing out in that market at the moment is people that are doing these sort of linear training sessions that are sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, magically you can run a learning team. And on the journey that I've been on and spent some time with you guys, it's more than just I've done some training, now I can run some learning teams. It's very much about having somebody coach you, somebody mentor you on that journey, and reflecting on how each one of those has gone. And both of you have been doing it quite a bit longer than I have. How have you found that journey? Because I think it's really important as we bring more and more people find this as one of the things that they can do to increase operational learning. How have you gone on that journey?
Well, look, I would have to say how I ran a learning team all those years ago and how I run a learning team now is completely different.
Yep.
And how I will facilitate a learning team, say a year from now, will be different to what I'm doing today. And I think one of the most important elements of it is to basically say, when I'm there facilitating a learning team, I'm not there as an expert. I'm there to be curious. I'm there to help stimulate the conversation. I'm there to take the load off the other people that are participating, because we want them to be able to express and to share their knowledge rather than create those barriers in doing that. One of the most important elements from my perspective is being able to reflect. And that was probably one of the harder skills it took for me over time, was that ability to reflect. And in the book, The Practice of Learning Teams, we actually set up that process of maintaining a journal, because it's really important that the facilitator can not only make notes about what did the organisation learn and what the workers learn, but also what did the facilitator learn. And I can share with you, I just ran a learning team just yesterday. I learned so much from that process.
And that it was different to what you've done before, or was something that you got out of about the learning team?
Yeah, and about the people and how they participate. So this was a learning team as a result of a major piece of property damage that could have ended up going sideways in terms of person being harmed. And we had different groups present in that learning team. And the person who was operating the piece of plant at the time, he was present and he was quite angry to begin with. And I think his anger really came from probably what he had been told to turn up to this. But by the end of the learning team, it didn't matter what I said at the beginning. It was all about the actions of others and how the room felt. By the end of it, he actually said to me, this was not about blame, this was about learning. I know what I did wrong. He says, I know what I did wrong.
So do you rate that in one of your top 10 learning team outcomes?
Well, I rate it from the point of view that he left that learning team gaining a lot more knowledge than when he started.
Yep.
And he left that learning team probably more psychologically safe than when he started.
Because he felt that he was
listened
to. He wasn't being
judged.
Yeah.
The focus was all around the system and not him. And I think the key to it is, in this case, the way I explained to the learning team was that we were going to look at what did normal work look like. So what does normal work look like? And then what did work look like on the day of the event? So we didn't really touch on the event until very late in the learning team. So the whole focus was around normal work. And very quickly people were able to point out that difference that happened between normal work and the work on the day.
Yep.
And what was quite fascinating from my point of view, in under 40 minutes we identified the root cause. Okay, and it simply came down to change management of the risk. There were some repairs being done, people weren't able to access certain parts of the facility, people were having to behave in different ways, and everyone was trying to do the right job. They're all trying to be as effective and as efficient as possible. And it was simply just one of those things that could happen.
So from that point of view, is it the first time the organisation had used a learning team?
It wasn't the first time, but it was probably the first time that rather than sitting down and taking statements that everyone signed,
Yep.
that everyone got together and actually had a conversation.
Yeah. Okay.
They shared a story.
So, so they had the industry expert running a learning team. But I think as time goes on, and one of the things that Tony and Stephen talked about was the role of the HSR and how we help HSRs. This is a new skill set for them. It's not what they've typically done in the past. So how do organizations help their HSRs develop that skill? And that, back to Deirdre's point that there's a lot of coaching and mentoring that will need to go on to get people up to that level. It's not about just training. It's about that ongoing journey about, as you said, Brett, where you started from several years ago to where you are now, and how it'll look in a year's time. So, Glynis, and from your point of view, you've been on the same journey. It's going to be quite an interesting change for some of the HSRs that we come across in the industry to take them on that journey, isn't it?
Yeah, look, absolutely. But I think it's going to be, it's an interesting journey for everyone. Just as Brent said, it's a matter of trying things out. We often work together when we do learning teams, just because of how it sort of works out. And it's an opportunity then to reflect, to talk about what worked well, what didn't work well. I think the thing with learning teams, what you gain is confidence over time, and what you gain is a range of strategies that you're able to use. So for me, the training, if it's linear, what's missing is the opportunity for somebody to try something, reflect on how well it went, and then bounce those ideas off somebody else who's further down the path than you are. I think the way to learn to be a very good facilitator in this context is to learn something about yourself, to try it out, so to be exposed to learning teams, to reflect on your practice, what were you good at, where were the areas that could have gone better with somebody who's more skilled than you are, and then kind of keep a diary of what it is that you've been doing, so that you can see that incremental learning as it takes place. There is definitely a skill set that needs to be developed. So whether it be a manager or whether it be a rep, actually that skill set still needs to be developed, and everybody will have an individual starting point, and they will have different things that they will need to work on.
I think I've found it powerful when I've run a team and I haven't felt that I got everything out of it that I could have. And I've spoken to Brent or I've spoken to you and said, this is one of the issues I had. And, one of them was that I remember not having somebody there taking the notes. You're trying to run the team and take the notes, So some of those, just those things that you're not thinking about at the time, that you run it past somebody, said, if you've got this many people, you need somebody else to help you break it up. You can't go for that 40 minutes by yourself. It is really powerful having been able to bounce those, outcomes, or, even if it's a negative outcome, off somebody that's done it before, to go, yeah, no, I've had the same problem. And this is what I tried. It seemed to work the next time. It was much better.
Yeah, but it's not a linear process. It's not a formula. You don't start at A and end up at Z or Z. No. It just doesn't work that way. Going back to the comment about health and safety reps, I was thinking about that quite a bit, and I was just sort of posing the question, with reps, we know that reps by their nature don't get much soft skills training, particularly when they are undertaking their own certification as a rep, as the worker representative. They don't get a lot of training on soft skills. And I was actually just pondering in my own head about maybe we need to start with reps, about getting them to simply go out and be curious with the workers, because they are the worker representative.
Yeah.
And to spend time in the workplace talking to the people they represent and just being curious and just asking those basic questions that we have in the book about, in the job that you do, what's the sticky? What's the stuff that can kill you?
Yeah.
Okay, given that our systems aren't perfect, our processes aren't perfect, our people aren't perfect, what stops you from getting hurt? And just, I think if we start that curious question, I think that can take them a long way to then coming into a learning team.
And again, I think you need permission to do that.
Yeah.
You know, we've got to give our representatives the permission to go out and have those conversations, and we need to do it in a way that's expedient. You know, we can't have them off the tools. We can't have them, you know, going out and having those conversations all the time. So we need to set up opportunities for them to be able to do that. I really want to thank Deirdre. She really started us off on this sort of tangent of thinking about sharing versus learning within a learning team. And I think it's something that we all need to be really mindful of as practitioners. You know, it's one thing to come together and have these rich, nuanced conversations with the workers, but we've actually got to capture it. We've got to do something with that information, and we've got to turn it into learning. And I think that learning is going to look different depending on the context of the learning team. But I suppose it's something that we should really sort of start to think about and kind of put some thoughts around. So Brent, what's your thoughts on this? How do we move from, say, just sharing over to learning in a learning team?
Well, I mean, you know, for us to learn, we have to share, and then we have to do a bit of reflection. There's a few things that happen in between. But I think learning just does not come physically from sharing. It comes from basically each person being able to sort of understand or analyse what's being shared with them, about how that reflects or resonates to themselves. They want to be able to sort of challenge that information as well. And it's those steps that start to move on to that learning journey. And you know, once again, there is a pitfall. If all we do is get people around the room and share stuff and nothing happens with it, why would I bother?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's going to be one of the biggest reasons that learning teams fails to embed within an organisation, is that there is far too much talking and not enough doing.
Yeah, I think there has to be an action. You know, if you've taken the time and energy to put a learning team together, you would think that there has to be an action that comes out of it, or an outcome that comes from it, you know, whether it's improvement in your system or some continuous improvement to the overall operation or whatever it may be, or, you know, improvement to a safety outcome. And, you know, we've seen this in the past with lean projects where people get very evangelical about it and then nothing happens. And so all that energy vaporizes. So I think what we've got with the learning team is this really amazing group of people that have got this energetic outcome, and they're looking for the organization to actually do something with it. And that actually validates their input into that learning team. But to Brent's point about, you know, not just sharing it, I find that unless I can put it into my own context, then I don't necessarily learn anything from it. So it's about being able to put it into my own context, into the work that I do every day when I've been a participant in one of those. And it'll be the same for the other people that are in these learning teams. They have to be able to put it into their own context and say, well, that's what we learned from here. But if I do this in my environment, in my day-to-day work, it makes sense to me and I've learned something from it. And that's how, you know, I think that learning and sharing is really interesting. I think what we'll see in some of the corporate, well, you know, speaking to some of the corporate people that we have spoken to over this journey, is sometimes they try and capture it in a video and it goes into a database somewhere. And I think that's where it gets lost again, because not all the people that are in these have access to that database or can reflect on it. And, you know, It's something I love the idea of putting something in a repository somewhere we can go and check out later on. I think that's, but I don't know if it actually works. How do we, and that's the quintessential question, isn't it? How do we get that out to other people within the organisation?
So you're saying it's more than a Kodak moment?
It is more than a Kodak moment.
And for those listeners under 35, please Google what Kodak means.
And I've got a 16-year-old that's really into, she's got a film camera but doesn't know where to get it processed. That's now the new problem. Where do you process your Kodak moment?
I can well imagine.
But look, I think this is the crux of it, isn't it? This is I think comes down to a skill set of the facilitator. I think the facilitator needs to constantly reframe what's being discussed so that people can actually grab hold of the whiffin, what's in it for me, so that they can see for themselves what is their context, how does it apply to what they do. But more importantly, I think what the facilitator needs to be able to do is pull out what are those key learnings. Now that may be presented in all sorts of different ways. It could be, as you've said, the Kodak moment. It could be a set of very specific actions. It could be a set of staged actions, what the workers are going to do, what a team is able to do, what the organisation needs to do. But actually that comes down to one of the roles of the facilitator of learning teams. But I think it's something that we need to be really mindful of when we're the practitioner here and when we are the ones that are leading the learning teams, to provide the balance so that there is enough sharing so that we achieve things like psychological safety. We allow enough time so people can delve into the nuances and do that problem identification, but at the same time we're really mindful of what it is that we're trying to achieve from the session and what will the outcomes look like. How will somebody be able to utilize those in a tangible way?
Yeah, I think I just want to go back to one of the points Brent made, and I think this is very important in that the leadership have given permission at the very start. So when the information and the learning comes out of the learning team and there's an outcome that's required, that they've got to be prepared to hear that information come back to them. And if they're not, then you haven't really given permission, have you, as a leader? And I think that's super important, and because that will stifle the next learning team for sure. If the leader says, okay, we've given permission, we've got psychological safety, we really want you guys to be engaged in this, the information comes back out and they go, oh, I don't want to do anything with it. Therefore, that becomes a problem.
Look, I agree. Any learning team, the learnings, some of them can be a sweetener, some of them can be slightly bitter.
Oh, definitely.
And I think that's really the key to them. And just thinking about it, I've actually come up with the phrase for the day from Glynis' conversation. I've got here, talking gives context to the doing.
Oh.
Do we like that?
That sounds really sweet.
Talking gives context to the doing.
Whose is that?
I just made it up.
Oh, it must be yours then. Okay.
Yeah. I'll copyright it before somebody else takes
beautiful.
it. Okay. One of the interesting conversations that was had with Stephen and Tony was about the value of being a learning organisation. And just to provide some context to that, they talked about the fact that they started their journey looking at trying to implement Safety 2. That was their primary focus. And through their journey of using learning teams, what they realised is that if they were to start this again, they wouldn't start off trying to be a safety organisation. They'd actually start the process by saying, what is a learning organisation? And how do we become a learning organisation?
I think that's really exciting that they've separated it out from that Safety 2 journey, because it is about learning. It's about operational learning. It's about not just safety, but operational excellence, continuous improvement across. And Deidre talked about that as well. One of the things that she talked about, that learning teams are out using them outside of just safety. And it is about that learning organisation, isn't it? I mean, that's where we're heading. It started off with the work that Todd did and around safety, but it's actually growing out of that. The learning teams that I've been doing have been quite often around operational improvement and how we can, and getting the people that are doing the day-to-day stuff, how they make the operation function better no matter what it is, whether it's blue collar, white collar, it doesn't matter. And it's about that organisation moving forward. And I think, in some respects, it's been people try and put it in that box of safety 1, safety 2. It doesn't matter. It in my mind, supersedes that conversation. It's at that next level in my mind.
And I think this divide that is created between these two worlds, this divide that gets spoken about, simply really comes down to how those two different approaches actually learn.
Yes.
And I recently participated with a piece of guidance that's going to be coming out from the Safety Differently Forum around, from what I recall, they went out and they asked a bunch of people they think are thought leaders, God knows why I was included, but here I am. And they had that thing about what do these two worlds mean to you? And my response was simple, that if we think about the world that we're in, our learning opportunity comes from the fact that we want to embrace the adaptive nature of work. That we want to learn what that adaptation means and how to inform the system of that to make that system more resilient and more agile. If we think about traditional safety, safety is treating that adaptation as a variation. And it's really trying to take that variation, it's trying to stamp it out. It's trying to put it back in within its structure itself around that. And it does that through that whole sort of rules process or procedures process. So I think, learning is learning. And there are different ways to learn. But what I like about learning teams is that learning teams is agnostic. Learning teams does not care what your system is. Because the learning team itself simply creates the opportunity for learning to occur.
Absolutely, and I think what we need to be doing is we need to be moving away from these constructs. Whether you're safety 1 or whether you're safety 2, actually what we need to be saying is how do we manage risk? How do we know that what we are doing is going to lead to a good outcome, both for people, plant, equipment, for quality, for whatever it might be? We need to have a system in place that allows us to do those checks and balances. And that's really where learning can occur. It can be about asking people what it is that they're doing well. It's about where are the rubs, what are the things that are getting in their way of good practice. And actually that, I agree with you, Brent, that sits outside of those constructs. It really is trying to get to the heart of the matter of people. So it's learning from one another so that the organisation can develop much better systems and processes that are far more agile to how work is really being done.
And all modern standards, whether it's safety, whether it's environmental, quality, security, all these modern standards today, all talk about the same thing. Where are the opportunities for improvement present? And it says, the organisation needs to go and find those opportunities. The other thing that fascinated me was a conversation that happened in episode 22, where Stephen talked about using learning teams for opportunity for alignment. And those words really resonated with me because it made me think about what did he really mean by that? And I sort of came back to those risk management principles, that opportunities for alignment is about looking at the efficacy of our controls. So we do all these things, we have all these mitigations, we have these barriers, we have these controls, and those controls are there to either manage how the hazard releases energy or to try and influence the hazardous situations that people get themselves into with the hazards themselves. And I really thought about it, that running a learning team to simply look at the alignment between work as imagined and work as done is very powerful. Because it doesn't necessarily have to be an improvement. It could simply be some type of engagement that is looking at the efficacy of the mitigations or the controls to understand how those controls are viewed by those who are exposed to the risk. And I found that quite powerful.
I think that alignment piece and how the controls are actually working for the people that are having to either use them or be protected by them is actually really powerful, because how often do we actually go and do that and ask that question? So that is there's a whole episode there, really, isn't there, to understand and discuss that even further. It's an interesting way of looking at it.
I think following on from what you were just saying, Brent, by reviewing workers' successful so that we have an opportunity to review those controls, I think the learning teams can play part of that kind of assurance and verification piece, so that we actually know that the controls are working the way that we think they are. Again, I think that we often are looking for quantitative measures to tell us whether or not we've been successful, but actually going back and talking to people at source about how they view those controls, which ones work for them, why is it that some things are inherently clunky. Actually, that gives us greater insight and gives us much stronger insight with regards to alignment than really any other metric that we might be using.
And I think that conversation links back into Deirdre's one, that it's, so if we talk about looking at opportunities for alignment, that actually then feeds back into being able to justify the cost of a learning team, because it is a piece of assurance work.
Yeah.
And assurance is really important. And it doesn't matter what type of risk you are evaluating. It's not just about health and safety anymore. And it's really interesting that as the episodes carried through, this other theme that started to emerge was the fact that as leaders began to hear these stories, see these stories around operational learning, their immediate response was, can we take it outside of safety?
Well, they can see a value, can't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Which is interesting, because then they see the value, which means that you don't need to justify it. Because if the leaders see the value in it, the bean counters aren't having to worry about, the cost of having 8 people on a learning team, or the disruption to the business.
For 50 minutes.
Yeah. That goes back to that whole sort of valued versus non-valued activity.
Oh.
Which goes back to really about the role of the facilitator, making sure that you're very clear about what are you trying to achieve with a learning team, making sure that leadership really endorse the value of a learning team, and then that the facilitator sets up an environment where you've got strong psychological safety, has that balance between sharing and learning, provides the context around learning so people can take away those nuggets of learning, but at the same time is able to send that learning throughout the organisation. So all of these things are really interconnected.
So on that, over the series, dealing with Deirdre and Stephen and Tony, there were about 26 different things that were discussed during those 3 episodes. That's a lot of content, a huge amount of content. And of that, there were about those 16 core themes that emerged. And I'm going to share with you guys, I took so much from those conversations that they had. And I guarantee that when we reconnect with those guys the next time, we'll probably have 16 different other conversations at the same time. So just for wrapping up, what are your closing thoughts?
I think learning teams is about learning. And I think your last comment there really explains how we're learning all the way. And it's adapting over a period of time. It goes back to one of your very first comments, Brent, about what we do this year will be different next year. And as the stuff adapts and grows out into other parts of the business, it is just showing the power of it. But it comes back to the power, not the power of the facilitator, but the skills of the facilitator, and the needing to help coach and mentor them. I think that's super powerful, and we need to keep working on that.
And I think that means that these constructs that we use around maturity scales don't work for learning teams.
No, I think, as we've talked about, that it's not a linear journal. I think it's a linear journey, rather. I think it's something that, evolves. So, the takeaway that I get from this is that we need to get out and try it, but more importantly, we need to be part of a community of practice. We need to be sharing with one another what's working, what's not, where are the things that we get tripped up, what are the things that we can share with somebody else so that can expedite their journey. So really, for me, it's about how do we continue to share? How do we get opportunities to come back and talk with Deirdre and Stephen and Tony and others? There are a lot of other people out there that are doing this and doing it really well. How do we capture that, and how do we put it together so that other people can take those learnings on board?
So in wrapping up, a huge thanks to Deirdre, Stephen and Tony in participating in our virtual tour of Downunder. Both countries went through numerous lockdowns during that time, which was interesting by itself. And of course, a big thanks both to Glynis McCarthy and Brent Robinson participating today. We will be resuming our normal program during the month of March, and we have some super exciting things happening in April, which we'll talk about in the next coming weeks. Thank you, listeners, for being part of this podcast. We'd love to hear your learnings from today or other topics you would like us to support you on. Go to www.podcastlearnings.com and be part of the community practice of learning teams at www.learningteamscommunity.com.
The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the host and its guest and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the company. Examples of analysis discussed within this podcast are only examples. They should not be utilized in the real world as the only solution available, as they are based only on very limited and dated open source information. Assumptions made within this analysis are not reflective of the position of the company. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, mechanical, electronic, recording, or otherwise, without prior written permission of the creator of the podcast, Jay Allen.